The Wellington funeral home stood like an alabaster fortress against Boston's grey January sky, its colonial columns and manicured shrubbery declaring old money to anyone who passed by. Through its mahogany doors streamed the city's elite, their designer black clothing and gleaming jewelry incongruous with their performative expressions of grief. Today marked the final farewell to James Wellington II, and by extension, a chance to be seen at the social event of the season. Dorothy Mae Johnson's arthritic fingers clutched her worn leather purse as she stood at the bottom of the granite steps. At 78, the climb looked more daunting than it should have, but it wasn't the stairs that made her hesitate. Above her, Regina Wellington Pierce's voice carried on the bitter wind, sharp as a razor's edge. "I simply can't believe the turnout." The governor himself sent his regrets. The young parking attendant had given Dorothy a peculiar look when she arrived in her weathered Oldsmobile, so out of place among the gleaming luxury cars. Now, as she finally made her way up the steps, she felt more eyes on her, questioning, dismissive, some barely concealing their disdain. Her sensible black dress, purchased on sale at Macy's, might as well have been a neon sign announcing she didn't belong. Inside, the funeral home's grand foyer buzzed with sophisticated murmurs. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over oil paintings and flower arrangements that cost more than Dorothy's monthly pension. A string quartet played something appropriately somber in the corner, though few seemed to be listening. They were too busy navigating the complex social choreography of a blue-blood Boston funeral. In the second row, a funeral director with perfectly coiffed silver hair gestured to a group of board members from Wellington Industries. Then his eyes fell on Dorothy, hovering near the back. "Ah, general seating is in the rear section," he added, his professional smile never reaching his eyes. Dorothy nodded, as she had nodded thousands of times before, and took her seat in the last row. From here she could observe it all: Catherine Wellington dabbing at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, surrounded by a protective circle of socialites, James's business partners, exchanging discreet conversations about who would fill his seat on various boards. Young parents shushing their children while simultaneously making sure everyone noticed their Gucci morning attire. The program in Dorothy's lap was heavy cardstock, the kind that spoke of money in its very texture. Her fingers traced the gold-embossed letters of James's name, lingering on the dates below 1945 to 2025. A sad smile touched her lips. She knew those dates better than anyone in this room, better than the woman listed as beloved mother. In the family section, better than Regina, who'd been James's constant companion through childhood, better even than the priest who would soon speak of a life he knew only through carefully curated anecdotes. The string quartet's music faded, and the funeral director approached the podium. Dorothy's hand slipped into her purse, fingers wrapping around a sealed envelope that had arrived by courier 3 days ago. Soon, every person in this room would understand exactly why she had come. As the funeral director droned on about James Wellington II's business accomplishments, Dorothy's mind drifted back to 1944, when she first stepped through the service entrance of the Wellington summer estate on Cape Cod. She had been 17 then, fresh-faced and determined, one of dozens of black housekeepers who kept the wheels of high society turning while remaining invisible to those they served. The Cape House had been her whole world that first summer, its endless windows to wash, its Persian rugs to vacuum, its silver to polish. She learned quickly that good service meant anticipating needs before they arose, becoming part of the furniture, present but unseen. But James Wellington, I had seen her. Fresh from the European front, haunted by what he'd witnessed in the war, he'd actually looked at her as a person. That's where it all began. Dorothy's fingers tightened around the envelope in her purse as a new speaker took the podium. Howard Blackwood, CEO of Wellington Industries. James was more than just our company's chairman, he announced, his voice practiced and smooth. He was a visionary who transformed a family business into a global empire. She almost smiled at that. If only Howard knew about the times she'd found young James, not yet 10 years old, hiding in the kitchen with a book while his father hosted business dinners upstairs. How many nights had she sat with him at the servants' table, helping him with his mathematics homework while his parents attended charity galas? The James she knew hadn't cared about empires. "Mother, are you all right?" Regina's voice carried from the front row, where she fussed over Catherine Wellington. "Do you need your pills?" Catherine Wellington, now there was a story. Dorothy remembered the day she arrived at the estate as a young bride in 1944, all pearls and perfect posture. She had treated the staff with detached politeness, never cruel but never truly kind. When baby James arrived in 1945, Catherine had barely touched him, leaving his care to a rotating staff of nannies. But publicly, she was the picture of maternal devotion. The mourners saw what they wanted to see: James Wellington II, the privileged son who'd had everything handed to him on a silver platter. They remembered his Harvard education, his effortless charm at social events, his seemingly natural gift for leadership. None of them knew about the secret visits to Dorothy's modest apartment in Roxbury, where he'd spend hours talking about his dreams of using the family wealth to make real change in the world. James never forgot where he came from, Dorothy thought, remembering his weekly phone calls even after he took over the company. He'd seek her counsel on everything from business decisions to personal matters, always addressing her as Mama Dot when they were alone. The other housekeepers had nicknamed her the Wellington Whisperer during her 40 years of service, never knowing how deep that connection truly ran. A photo montage began playing on the screens flanking the podium: James at his boarding school graduation, at his wedding to Elizabeth Cabot, who'd left him for a real estate developer in Palm Beach, at countless charity functions and board meetings. Dorothy noticed they'd left out the photo from the company's 50th anniversary celebration, where she'd been captured in the background, James's hand resting briefly on her shoulder as he passed. She'd kept a copy of that photo, along with others the family never knew existed. The current crop of Wellington Industries executives saw James as a brilliant strategist who'd modernized the company. The society ladies remembered him as the handsome widower who never remarried, dedicating himself instead to philanthropic causes. The old money families recalled his impeccable manners and perfect social graces, proof that proper breeding would always tell. But Dorothy remembered the real James, the little boy who'd sneak her homemade cookies when she was cleaning the library, the teenager who'd confided his fears about living up to the Wellington name, the man who'd secretly funded college scholarships for the children of his household staff. She remembered his quiet strength, his hidden kindness, and most of all, his promise that someday the truth would be told. The string quartet began another piece, something by Mozart, James's favorite. Dorothy closed her eyes, remembering how he'd played the same melody on the grand piano in the Cape House Library, his young fingers stumbling over the keys while she dusted and pretended not to listen. That was before Catherine had ended the music lessons, declaring them a distraction from more suitable pursuits. From the front row came the soft sound of Regina's barely concealed sobs. Dorothy opened her eyes to see several society ladies patting Regina's shoulder, murmuring comforting platitudes. They had no idea that the real story of James Wellington I was about to rewrite everything they thought they knew about privilege, power, and the true meaning of family. The funeral service paused for a brief intermission, allowing the mourners to stretch their legs and engage in what they did best: talk. Dorothy remained in her seat, becoming once again invisible to the clusters of people who gathered nearby, their voices carrying clearly in the ornate space. James always said the Wellington Foundation was his greatest achievement, declared Margaret Whitmore, a board member with perfectly coiffed silver hair. Though I must say, some of his recent decisions were questionable. The diversity initiatives, another board member muttered, shaking his head, throwing away generations of careful investment on inner-city programs. Dorothy's fingers curled into fists in her lap. If they only knew that James had started those initiatives after discovering his own grandfather had refused loans to black business owners in the 1960s. She remembered the night he'd found those documents in the company archives, how he'd shown up at her apartment at midnight, his hands shaking with anger. "Did you hear about the new scholarship program?" A younger woman in Chanel joined the conversation. "Full rides for housekeeping staff's children. Can you imagine?" Catherine was livid. Speaking of staff, Regina's voice cut through as she approached the group, casting a pointed glance toward Dorothy. "Some people really don't understand their place, even today of all days." Dorothy stood slowly, smoothing her dress. Instead of retreating, she walked purposefully toward the display of photos near the podium. She could feel Regina's group watching, their disapproval radiating like heat. "Excuse me," Dorothy addressed the funeral director, her voice clear and steady. "There seems to be a photo missing, the one from the company's 50th anniversary. Regina swooped in before the director could respond. We selected the most appropriate images of James's life, Mrs. Johnson, is it? I'm sure you understand that certain moments are more relevant than others. Relevant. Dorothy met Regina's gaze. Like the summer of '85, when James cancelled his trip to Martha's Vineyard to sit with your father during his chemotherapy. Or perhaps like the Christmas Eve when he drove through a blizzard to bring presents to your children because you were stuck in Aspen. Regina's face flushed. How dare you? I dare because I was there, Miss Regina. For all of it, including the night you came to the house crying because your first husband had gambled away your trust fund. James didn't just write you a check, he spent 3 hours helping you plan how to start over. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the tension. Dorothy heard whispers, who does she think she is? Someone should remove her. Always knew James was too soft on the help. Near the refreshment table, 2 elderly men discussed James's business acumen. Brilliant move, selling off the old manufacturing plants, one said. Though of course that was his father's guidance. Dorothy couldn't help herself. Actually, James sold those plants because he discovered they were dumping chemicals in poor neighborhoods. He used the money to fund environmental cleanup. The men stared at her, aghast. One of them, Herbert Coleman, she recognized him from company parties, puffed up like an indignant rooster. Madam, I sat on that board for 30 years. I think I know. You sat on the board every third Thursday, Mr. Coleman. I served coffee at those meetings for 4 decades, and I listened. The whispers grew louder. Catherine Wellington rose from her seat, approaching with the regal air of someone used to being obeyed. Mrs. Johnson, she said, her voice dripping with false courtesy. Perhaps it would be best if you paid your respects and moved along. This is a family affair, after all. Dorothy reached into her purse, touching the envelope again. Yes, Mrs. Wellington. Family is exactly what this is about. The string quartet had stopped playing. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, watching the confrontation between the elderly black housekeeper and Boston's elite. James always said his greatest regret was living behind masks, Dorothy continued, her voice carrying in the tense silence, pretending to be what others expected, rather than who he truly was. James said no such thing, Regina snapped. I was his closest confidante. I knew everything about him. Dorothy's sad smile held decades of secrets. Did you know he played Mozart at midnight in the library? That he read philosophy books in the kitchen while I baked? That he spent every Christmas morning for 20 years serving breakfast at the Roxbury homeless shelter before coming to your fancy parties? Lies, Catherine declared, but her voice wavered. James would never. The only lie, Dorothy interrupted, drawing herself up to her full height, is the story you've all been telling today, about a man you thought you knew, but never really saw, just like you never saw me, except as part of the furniture. But James saw me. He saw everyone you all tried to ignore. The funeral director approached nervously. Mrs. Johnson, if you continue to disrupt. I'm not disrupting anything, Dorothy said firmly. I'm fulfilling a promise. One I made to James Wellington. The last time I saw him, 3 weeks ago in his hospital room. She pulled out the envelope. It's Wellington Industries letterhead gleaming under the chandelier lights. He asked me to wait until today, until everyone who needed to hear the truth was gathered. The envelope felt heavy in her hands, heavy with secrets, with justice delayed but not denied, with a truth that would shatter the perfect glass world of the Wellingtons forever. Catherine, Dorothy said softly, you might want to sit down for this. The funeral home's silence was absolute as Dorothy made her way to the podium, each step echoing against marble floors. She placed James's envelope beside the microphone, her weathered hands steady despite the weight of the moment. The assembled mourners watched with a mixture of indignation and uncomfortable curiosity. Boston's elite weren't used to being challenged, especially not by someone they considered beneath them. I came to work for the Wellingtons in the summer of 1944, Dorothy began, her voice clear and strong. I was 17, and James Wellington, I had just returned from Europe. The war had changed him. He saw things in France that haunted him, things that made him question everything he'd been taught about who was superior and who was inferior. Catherine Wellington shifted in her front row seat, her face a mask of controlled displeasure. Regina moved to stand, but Catherine gripped her arm, holding her in place. That summer, James II and I found ourselves talking in the kitchen late at night. He couldn't sleep because of the nightmares. I was up late cleaning. He told me about the concentration camps he'd helped liberate, about seeing firsthand what happened when people decided some lives were worth more than others. Dorothy paused, reaching for a glass of water. Her next words would change everything. By autumn, we had fallen in love. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Catherine's fingers whitened around her handkerchief. We knew it was impossible, Dorothy continued. A wealthy white man from Boston's oldest family and a black housekeeper, in 1944. But love doesn't always ask permission. When I discovered I was pregnant in early 1945, James II was already engaged to Catherine. His father had arranged the marriage to merge two of Boston's most prominent families. The funeral director stepped forward, but Dorothy held up her hand. You'll want to hear this. It's all in the letter. She patted the envelope. James made sure of that. This is preposterous, Regina burst out. Aunt Catherine is James's mother. Everyone knows that, but Dorothy's sad smile carried decades of pain and patience. Catherine was told she was receiving a private adoption, a baby from a good family who needed to be placed discreetly. James II arranged everything, using his war connections. I was sent away to a remote house in Vermont, where I gave birth on September 15, 1945. 3 days later, my son was taken to Boston and presented as Catherine and James II's natural child. She closed her eyes, remembering. They let me stay on as a housekeeper, said it would look suspicious if they fired me. So I watched my own son grow up calling another woman mother. I dusted his baby pictures and changed his sheets and served him breakfast, always pretending I was just another servant. Opening the envelope, Dorothy removed a stack of papers. James II swore me to secrecy, but he set up a trust fund for me, paid for my apartment, made sure I was taken care of. He wanted to do right by me, in the only way his world would allow. When he died in 1980, I thought the truth would die with him. She held up a faded photograph. But James, my James, he knew. Children sense things. He'd seek me out, tell me his secrets, ask my advice. By the time he was 12, he'd figured it out. The way I looked at him, the way his father treated me differently, the resemblance he saw when he looked in the mirror. Catherine stood abruptly, her voice shaking. You expect us to believe? Sit down, Catherine, Dorothy said quietly. You've played your part well for 78 years, but James left DNA test results in this envelope. Along with letters, photographs and hospital records from 1945, he wanted everyone to know the truth after he was gone. The papers trembled in Dorothy's hands as she continued. My son grew up in two worlds. In public, he was James Wellington II, heir to a fortune and a legacy. In private, he was the boy who sat in my kitchen learning his grandmother's recipes for sweet potato pie. The young man who secretly funded scholarships for other housekeepers' children. The business leader who pushed his company to confront its racist past and build a more just future. Tears rolled down Dorothy's cheeks now, unchecked. He wanted to tell the truth so many times, but I begged him not to. I didn't want the scandal to hurt his chances to do good in the world. He respected my wishes, but made me promise that after he was gone, I would finally claim my place as his mother. She turned to Catherine, her voice gentler now. He loved you too, Catherine. You raised him well. But he wanted everyone to know that his real legacy wasn't the Wellington name or money. It was the love that defied everything society said was proper and right. From the envelope, Dorothy withdrew one final item, a letter, in James's own handwriting. My son wrote this 3 days before he died. He asked me to read it today. It begins, to everyone gathered here, I leave you with one final truth. I lived my life between two worlds, born of a love that would have been condemned by everyone in this room. My mother, Dorothy Mae Johnson, taught me that character isn't inherited through bloodlines or bought with trust funds. It's built through choices, through kindness, through the courage to face hard truths. Dorothy's voice cracked as she read, but she stood straight and proud. Around her, the funeral home had erupted into chaos. Some guests were weeping, others arguing in harsh whispers. Regina had sunk into her chair, face buried in her hands. Catherine sat still as stone, staring at nothing. But Dorothy wasn't finished. She had one last truth to share, the secret that would explain everything about the changes in Wellington Industries, about James's mysterious charitable foundation, about the future he had planned even beyond his death. She looked out at the shocked faces of Boston's elite who had ignored her for so long. In her mind, she saw James as a little boy, climbing into her lap while she took her brief breaks in the kitchen. She heard his whispered words, "Someday, Mama Dot, we'll tell them all, and then we'll change everything." That someday had finally arrived. Dorothy's hands steadied as she continued reading James's letter, her voice carrying through the stunned silence of the funeral home. The Wellington Foundation, which many of you have praised today, was never just about charity. It was about justice. About addressing the wrongs that families like ours built our fortunes upon. Every scholarship, every grant, every initiative was designed with one purpose: to tear down the walls that kept my mother and me from acknowledging our true relationship in public. A choked sob escaped from Catherine Wellington. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled as she reached for her glass of water, spilling it across her designer dress. No one moved to help her. To the board members, who questioned my decisions. Dorothy continued reading. "You never understood that our company's diversity programs weren't about politics or public relations. They were about creating a world where no mother would have to spend decades pretending she didn't give birth to her own child." Howard Blackwood, the CEO, stood up abruptly. The trust fund documents, they were all there in the corporate archives. The monthly payments to a DM, Johnson since 1945. We always assumed it was some sort of pension arrangement. "Because you never imagined I could be anything more than the help," Dorothy responded, her voice firm but not unkind. James knew that mindset well. It's why he spent the last 30 years quietly transferring controlling interest in Wellington Industries to the foundation. Another wave of gasps swept through the crowd. Regina's face had gone pale. "What are you saying?" Dorothy withdrew another document from the envelope. "As of today, the Wellington Foundation for Equal Opportunity owns 51% of Wellington Industries' voting shares, and according to my son's final wishes, I am the foundation's new chairwoman." The room erupted. Several board members jumped to their feet, smartphones already in hand. A younger Wellington cousin fainted, her pearls rattling against the wooden pew as she slumped. "This is impossible." Herbert Coleman's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. "The bylaws were changed 6 months ago," Dorothy interrupted, "at a board meeting where you were all too busy checking your stock portfolios to notice what you were approving. James made sure of that." She turned to Catherine, her voice softening. "He left you your shares, Catherine, and your place on the board. He never hated you. He understood you were as much a prisoner of this world as he was." Catherine looked up, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "All those times he came to you for advice, I thought he was just being kind to an old family servant. But he was talking to his mother." "Yes," Dorothy said simply. "And now, through the foundation, we'll help other families break free from the chains of prejudice and pretense. The scholarship program will expand to all employees' children. The corporate headquarters will be relocated to Roxbury, bringing jobs to the community. And the Wellington name will finally stand for something more than old money and older prejudices." From her seat in the front row, Regina had begun to laugh, a high, slightly hysterical sound. "Do you really think Boston society will accept this? A former housekeeper running one of the city's oldest companies." Dorothy smiled, and for a moment, everyone in the room could see James in her face, the same quiet confidence, the same steady gaze. "Boston society will adapt, just like you will, Regina. Because the alternative is watching the Wellington fortune fund every progressive cause you've spent your life fighting against." She held up one final paper. "My son also left instructions about his penthouse apartment on Beacon Hill. It's being converted into transitional housing for homeless families. He suggested, Regina, that you might want to volunteer there, to learn, as he put it, what real class looks like." The string quartet, forgotten in their corner, had stopped playing entirely. The funeral director stood frozen, his carefully planned schedule in shambles. But Dorothy wasn't finished. She had one last card to play, the final proof of her son's love and his determination to change the world that had forced them apart. Her eyes swept the room, taking in the shocked faces, the dropped jaws, the expressions ranging from outrage to awe. In that moment, she wasn't just Dorothy Mae Johnson, the housekeeper. She was a mother reclaiming her child, a woman claiming her power, and the keeper of a legacy that would reshape Boston society forever. As the initial shock of Dorothy's revelations subsided, an unexpected calm settled over the funeral home. Catherine Wellington rose slowly from her seat, her movements deliberate, and made her way to the podium. The room held its breath, anticipating another confrontation. Instead, Catherine took Dorothy's hands in hers. "I always wondered," Catherine whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "why he looked at you with such love. Even as a baby, he would reach for you first." Tears streamed down her face. "I was so jealous, so afraid of losing my place. But I never really had it, did I?" Dorothy squeezed Catherine's hands gently. "You were his mother too. Love doesn't divide like mathematics. It multiplies." From the second row, Regina dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. "The Christmas dinners," she said softly. "When James insisted you join us at the main table, we all thought he was just being charitable, but—" Her voice trailed off as decades of memories shifted into new perspective. "My son lived in two worlds," Dorothy addressed the room, her voice carrying wisdom earned through years of patience. "He learned grace from Catherine, business from his father, and social standing from all of you. From me, he learned that love doesn't respect the boundaries we create. It blooms wherever it's planted." Young Thomas Wellington IV, James's second cousin, stepped forward. At 25, he represented the next generation of the family. "I think I speak for the younger Wellingtons when I say we're proud. Proud that James had the courage to plan this, proud to have Dorothy as part of our family officially." He turned to face the older generation. "The world is changing. Maybe it's time we change too." Dorothy smiled, seeing her son's spirit in this young man's words. The Wellington name doesn't need to be a barrier anymore. It can be a bridge. That's what James wanted, not to tear down tradition, but to expand it, to make room for all kinds of love, all kinds of family. The funeral director, finally finding his footing in this unprecedented situation, approached with fresh programs. On the cover, beneath James's name, a new line had been added: "Beloved son of Dorothy Mae Johnson and James Wellington II." As the updated program circulated, Dorothy watched the faces around her soften. The walls of privilege and prejudice hadn't crumbled entirely, but they had cracked. Through those cracks, something new could grow. "James chose love over fear," Dorothy concluded, her voice full of gentle strength. "Now we all have the same choice. We can cling to old divisions, or we can embrace a legacy that's big enough for everyone." The string quartet, sensing the moment, began to play Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus, the piece young James had practiced in secret all those years ago. As the music filled the room, Dorothy saw what her son had seen: a future where love wrote its own rules, and every mother could claim her child with pride. 1 year later, the Wellington Foundation's new headquarters in Roxbury buzzed with activity. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the chairwoman's office, Dorothy Mae Johnson Wellington watched children playing in the community garden she'd helped establish below. The same hands that had once polished Wellington's silver now signed grants and scholarship approvals. On her desk sat a family photo from last Christmas. The entire Wellington clan gathered around her, genuine smiles replacing forced politeness. Catherine had become a regular visitor, the two women finding unexpected friendship in their shared love for James. Even Regina had surprised everyone by throwing herself into the Foundation's housing initiative, discovering a talent for connecting with the families they helped. The old guard of Boston society had adapted, as old guards always do when change becomes inevitable. The Wellington name, once synonymous with exclusive privilege, now stood for breaking down barriers. Other prominent families had followed their lead, confronting their own histories and working toward real change. Dorothy touched the small photo of James she kept beside her computer. "We did it, son," she whispered. "We showed them that courage and truth are the greatest inheritance of all." Let that be a lesson to our viewers. Sometimes the most powerful legacy isn't the one written in wills or carved on tombstones. It's the courage to be authentic, to speak your truth, and to let love light the way forward.